Objects tell us stories about the past, and by studying and recreating them, they help build our knowledge about those who came before. Join us here at Pottsgrove Manor as we talk with skilled artisans who share what they have learned as they work in remaking the past.
My name is Matt Brenckle. I'm a hatter or hat maker, and I primarily reproduce reproductions of 18th and 19th century hats.
Is there an original piece that first sparked your interest in studying and making these hats?
Yeah, I'm not sure there was one particular piece that really set me off on this journey, but certainly looking at original hats in museum collections I think when you try to make something, you look at how they were made in the past and you look at how people are making them today, and you put these two things side by side and you realize one is not like the other. So the quest has always been, how do you get closer to what they were doing in the past? And because of that, museum pieces are extremely important, obviously.
So is there something that you looked at an original hat and that really surprised you and changed how you thought you knew hats?
Yeah, I think one of the most surprising things I find when you look at original artifacts is just how fine they are compared to many reproductions today. They're much lighter. They're very tightly felted. The stitches are tiny in many cases. They're items of everyday clothing. They're not a costume. They're something that was meant to be used and abused in many cases. So they were made very well. And I think that's sort of the thing that I want to bring to a lot of my reproductions is trying to capture the feel of original objects.
Is there something that people really just misunderstand because the materials that we have today are different than what were 18th century things about hats and headwear and things?
Yeah, one of the big differences between hats of the 17th, the 18th, and the early part of the 19th century is they were made on round blocks or cylindrical blocks. So I actually have an example here. This is a reproduction block, and you can see it's round, obviously, whereas a modern block is oval shaped, and you can see that difference there. This seems like a very obvious thing because human heads are not round, they're oval shaped. But it wasn't until actually 1817 that an English hatter named Stephen Dando first came up with the idea, as far as we know, as the research stands to date. First came up with this idea of an oval hat block. And it wasn't until really the mid-19th century that they completely overtook the old round blocks that was being used primarily in the 18th century. So that's one of the big sort of, as you call it, technology shift that happens that really changes the look and the shape and the silhouette of hats. It sounds like a minor thing, but it actually really affects how the finished hat looks. Because as you stretch the hats, when they were retailed, when the customer bought them, the crown was opened up with a screw or a jack into an oval. And what that does is it introduces tension into the brim. So as you stretch it front to back, the sides tend to either droop or curl up. And that's how you get, for example, the classic Regency top hat or round hat that has a very deeply curled brim. It's because of the shape of the blocks that they were using that they could achieve that.
So talking about reproducing an object, can you take us through the process it is to make or remake either just a general 18th century hat, or if you have a specific one that you made specifically as a reproduction item?
Yeah, so historically, kind of the way that you would make a name as a hatter was not so much in the finished product, the style of the hat as we would think of it today, the fashion, which was temporary and always changing. The way that you really proved yourself as a hatter was in the quality of your felt. So historically, obviously, felt is made out of what can be either made of wool like this, or can be made of fur. This happens to be beaver pelt, which is for hundreds of years has been considered sort of the best thing that you can make a hat out of. So backing up slightly, felt is a weird material. It's not like cloth. A lot of people see hats and they're like, oh, it's made of cloth. Well, it's not cloth. Cloth has a warp and a weft. It's woven on a loom, which gives it a direction. You can stretch it on the bias, on the diagonal, but for the most part, once it's finished, that's what you get. But felt, on the other hand, has no direction. So basically, if you ever looked at a hair or wool under a microscope, you'd notice that it has all these little barbs on each strand. And it's those barbs that allow it to lock together in this kind of solid mass. So here's just an example of felt. It has no direction. So with steam and hot water, you can stretch it in any direction. And that's what allows you to make a hat in basically any shape that you can imagine. They would first take the raw hides with the hair on. The guard hairs, these stiff hairs on top, were pulled off. And then the under fur is actually what you're using to make the hat with. It's very soft, luxurious, in the case of beaver. So that's gathered. It's laid out, arranged, and then through a series of hot water, using hot water and steam and pressure, all these fibers are compressed until you end up with this very solid, stable mass. And that's essentially what felt is. Now, from there, obviously, you're ending up, after the felting process, you still don't have a finished hat. You just have a big piece of felt. So again, once you get to this stage, it doesn't look very interesting, and certainly not a fashionable hat that you would be marketing in any shop. So from there, you're taking your felt and you're forming it over a block. And I showed you the blocks before. I'll just bring this one back. Basically wetting the felt, steaming the felt, makes it pliable. You can give it any shape you want. It's stretched over the block. It's dried. Then it's stiffened. Again, historically, they're using glue, actually, a sort of a thin hide glue to stiffen the hats. To make them very stiff, but not especially waterproof, as you can imagine. And one of a hatter's major tasks actually was renovating hats. People would bring their messed up hats to the hatter's shop, and they would press them and re-stiffen them and recock them. So anyway, so you would do that. After it's stiffened, the hat's trimmed to shape. So it could be anything. If it's a round hat, so-called, the brim's probably the same width all the way around. If it's a cocked hat, what people today often call tricorns, which, by the way, was not used historically, but cocked hat, so it could be in any form. Sometimes it's round and cocked up more or less equally, but often by late in the century, it's sort of more of an oblong shape. So you have this tall fan behind and a shorter front cock in front, something like this one here. You can see the dimensions there, just how much taller it is behind than in front. And that, that's kind of it in a nutshell. The brims are tied up with cocking loops, and then the inside is lined, often with glazed linen or silk for the better sorts of hats, or just plain linen for some of the cheaper hats. And again, those linings are really important too. A lot of people sort of leave that step out in some reproductions. Every original hat I've ever seen has had a lining or evidence of lining. And what that lining does is sort of acts as a sacrificial barrier between the sweat and oils of your hair or hair powder and the felt. And so you could, when your lining got grimy, you would take it to the hatter, they'd rip it out and put a new one in, and you'd have a more or less new hat.
What are some of the challenges that you've faced in studying these materials, whether that be in museums, pictures, online? Yeah, what challenges do hats throw at you?
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously in a museum, many times you're not allowed to touch something, which for good reason. So that's one thing. Not actually feeling the object can often be challenging. But really, I think one of the biggest problems, if you want to call it that, is that felt is incredibly malleable and it changes through time. So if you leave a hat sitting flat on its brim for 200 years, it kind of just flattens out. So a lot of times the cocking loops, the things holding up the sides, will have rotted or been removed for whatever reason. So the hat changes shape from what it was originally. So you can often line up the holes in the brim and in the crown to see, maybe what the original shape was. But I think a lot of times we look at these things, we're like, well, that's weird. But actually, they were fashionable hats when they were new. They just happened to have gotten a little slouchy in their old age. The further back in time you go, the fewer survivals there are. I mean, I think this is true with everything: architecture, clothing, plates, you name it. So things from I mean, you can find endless numbers of silk top hats from the 1890s or 1920s, but if you're looking for genuine 18th century hats, it becomes difficult. And a lot of the things that do survive in museum collections, things with, say, a Revolutionary War provenance, when you look into the history of ownership, a lot of the times you find that they actually date to the last years of the person's life, not when they served in the Continental Army, but when they were 70 years old and were wearing a sort of old-fashioned hat in the 1790s or 1805. So it's that's another challenge, is sort of accurately dating these things. And there are certain stylistic trends through the 18th century in sort of crown shape and the size of the brims and the way that other details are done that helps us decide whether this hat is in fact from the 1760s or from the 1790s. So that's another thing to keep in mind when looking at original objects.
Is there a really fun story that you want to share in your hat making journey?
I really I like looking at period newspapers for little snippets of hat history, because they're so ephemeral that they talk about things that don't make it into more formal sorts of writing. So people's memoirs or even people's journals in many cases. Newspapers, I don't know, they sort of capture the spirit of an age in a way that a lot of other things don't. So I guess just recently, one thing I was looking for, I was looking for something about hats from the 1830s for whatever reason. And I kept finding these articles that were reprinted through various New England newspapers about these stories of how Yankees, as they called them, New Englanders, really enjoyed carrying objects inside of their hats. So instead of using their pockets, they would stuff cigars and handkerchiefs and playing cards and food and a doctor with medicine bottles inside their hat. And these apparently had humorous outcomes at some point. There was a story of a young man who was walking home with a dozen eggs inside of his hat, and he met a young lady on the street, and of course, being the gallant that he was, he swept his hat off and threw eggs all over the pavement in front of her. So, again, whether these stories are true or they're just sort of this kind of funny thing that's passed from paper to paper, I don't know. But and then probably my all-time favorite story is about a hatter from Medford, Massachusetts, just the next town over from where I am, called Solomon Sanborn, who, when he died, bequeathed his body to the Harvard Medical School and insisted that Dr. Agassiz and Oliver Wendell Holmes dissect him, take his skin and tan it, and then make them into drum heads, on which would be inscribed Pope's Universal Prayer and the Declaration of Independence. They'd mount the drum heads on these two drums, which would then be given to his friend named Warren Simpson, under the condition that he would take it to Bunker Hill on the anniversary of the battle, 17th of June, every year, and play Yankee Doodle on them. And then that wasn't it. He said anything that was left over from this should be composted and used to fertilize an American elm that he wanted set out in some thoroughfare to act as a shady place for travelers. So mad as a hatter, I guess, rings true in that case.
Do you have any suggestions for anyone who's looking to make their own 18th century style hat?
I mean, it's not rocket science. It's actually historically it was said that it was one of the easiest trades to get into, because you don't actually need that many tools. It's not like a carpenter where you need a whole box of saws and chisels and all this sorts of thing. I mean, literally, you need a hunk of wood, and you need some sheep wool, and hot, obviously, source of hot water and fuel and all this sort of thing. But as far as industries go, it was not something that was hugely intensive in terms of resources. And the same is true today. I mean, you can buy hatter's felt in lots of different places around the world. You can have a block turned, and then it's just a matter of trial and error. I mean, I did not serve a formal apprenticeship to learn how to do this. And I don't think most of the sort of, boutique hatters who are working today in the modern fashion industry, I mean, some of them probably did, but I think a lot of them are self-taught. And it's just, again, just going out there and trying it. That's really the best thing you can do. You'll probably destroy a lot of hats in the process, but you'll figure it out eventually.
Is there a best part about making hats that you want to share?
Best part? Well, I mean, I love it. I really do. I've been doing this full time since 2016, but I've been doing it off and on for almost 20 years, and I never get tired of it. I even making the same thing over and over again, and I make a lot of the same hat over and over again, but it's really, I don't know, something about it. It's just so satisfying. It's just like, there's one measurement, so you can't really mess that up. And and then it's this self-contained unit. It's not like sewing a suit of clothes where you're working on seams forever or whatever, or buttonholes. You sit down and you make it, and it's done, and you have this thing that used to just be a flat piece of felt. It's pretty great.